I think it's only fitting that one of the leading groups addressing the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons is Physicians for Social Responsibility, or PSR. And we're honored to have as our first speaker today Dr. Andrew Kanter, the past president of PSR and a longtime board member. Dr. Kanter has been involved with nuclear issues since he was a student in the 1980s, where he founded a campus chapter of, was it then IPPNW, or International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which has now known today as Physicians for Social Responsibility. As I say that, I'll do a quick shout out to the fact we have another student group here today, Our Nuclear Future Group, which is a number of SGI students that are here. So listen well, with Dr. Kanter, we have a great example of someone who started in his, took the reins in the student years. That's why they're here. Thank you. So, Dr. Kanter is director of Columbia International eHealth Laboratory and an assistant professor at Columbia University School of Medicine in New York. He has spoken about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons at the United Nations and before many faith communities. Today, he is speaking with us, and we are honored to have him. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Kanter.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really grateful to the organizers to have included me in this program. I'm very honored to be in such august surroundings with some really prominent and well-known speakers. I feel a little strange being up here, but I think it's entirely appropriate for physicians to be speaking about this issue with the faith community, because it's both physicians in the faith community that are called on to provide meaning when there's suffering and to provide healing when things are broken. So I'm here specifically today to present some very scary results of some recent studies, and to give some context to the humanitarian consequences or humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. But I'm going to stray a little bit from that purely scientific presentation to discuss what I think is also the hope in the future going forward. I should mention actually that Physicians for Social Responsibility is the US affiliate of the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War. We actually just had our 50th anniversary a year or so ago, and IPPNW actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985 for primarily its educational efforts around the humanitarian, at that time called medical consequences of nuclear weapons. I always start my talk with this quote from Albert Einstein: "With the splitting of the atom, everything changed save man's mode of thinking, and thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe." And I think it's important context because over the last 60 years, very little has changed. And that if we don't do something now, we're in for a serious catastrophe. I also want to start with this picture from Hiroshima, because I think that this helps contextualize the discussion today, because not only on what I am going to describe and just the nature of these ecocidal weapons are terrible and dark, but within that there is seeds of truth that actually may lead to the rebirth of our civilization. And I think it's important to recognize not just the horror of what these weapons represent, but also what the solution for them, the potential it represents for us. I'm going to talk a lot initially about this report that was initially published by the Physicians for Social Responsibility and IPPNW in 2007, which describes essentially the humanitarian impact based on food and agriculture of a limited nuclear war in South Asia. This was recently updated last year to include additional information, and I'll touch on that as well. But what this report shows is that the initial studies that were done in the 1980s by Carl Sagan and others that warned us of the potential climatic effects of nuclear weapons, such as nuclear winter, were correct. And that even using the most up-to-date scientific models, that the information or the conclusions from that original study were not only correct, but are significantly worse. So I'm going to begin by actually describing what those studies showed. They're based upon original atmospheric science work by professors Toon and Robach, and they modeled in 2007 a limited nuclear or regional nuclear war involving India and Pakistan. This, at the time, was, and even now, was not only considered as a possible scenario and certainly conceivable, but maybe even probable. They modeled an exchange of 50 nuclear weapons, relatively small weapons of the size used on Hiroshima, involving both India and Pakistan against the major cities of the other. Their initial consequences were, as would probably be expected, although many people may not actually be in touch with these sorts of numbers, but there would be 20 million deaths involved in the major cities, both in India and Pakistan. That this represents close to half of all the deaths that occurred in World War II over an 8-year period, and we're talking about this occurring in about a week. There would be radioactive contamination that would be spread throughout the region. And then what's new, and what I would like to focus on today, is the global climate effects that are subsequent to those fires and destruction. So what actually happens when these nuclear weapons go off is they create massive firestorms within these urban centers. Anything that's flammable burns, and that these create superheated air and cloud that raise soot and materials high up into the atmosphere. Now, this atmospheric soot absorbs the sunlight, it blocks the sunlight, which dramatically reduces the amount of light and heat that reaches the surface of the planet. Now, this would lead to a reduction of 1.25, or about 1.3 degrees in centigrade over a period of a decade. Now, that may not seem like very much, but when you think about the global warming for which we have seen massive climate effects and weather effects over the last 20 or 50 years, that has been only a 0.7 degrees centigrade rise. So what we're talking about here is twice that amount of temperature change over a period of days. This would be global climate change unprecedented in recorded human history. And not only would the weather or the climate and the temperature change, but this has significant impacts on our ability to grow crops. And so the study shows how the reduced temperatures would reduce the amount of time or the growing season available for crops, particularly in the bread baskets of North America and Eurasia. There can be anywhere from, to 10 to 20 days reduction in the growing period. And many of our crops today require the entire growing period to mature, and therefore there's a likelihood of failure if a frost occurs, let's say, before the end of their maturity. It's not only the temperature and the growing season that is going to change. The atmospheric studies show that there will be significant reductions in precipitation over the decade. And it's a little hard to see from this chart, but if you look at in the centers, the dark part here, these are 40% reductions, 50% reductions in precipitation over the major crop growing areas of the world. So what we see in conclusion is when we combine the atmospheric information that we know from even a small percentage of these weapons being used, with the agriculture, that there is a particularly devastating impact. And so this sudden cooling, the decreased sunlight, the less rainfall, the shortened growing season are all going to reduce crop yields. The stratospheric ozone depletion, which occurs by these highly active particles being injected high into the atmosphere, will deplete the ozone and allow for more UV radiation, and that many of the crops that are sensitive to that will be affected. We know that in this kind of a situation that the global chaos that would ensue would disrupt petroleum supplies, and this also prevents much of the use of the machinery and the fertilizers necessary to increase our crop yields. And there will also be direct effects, as we have seen from the Fukushima accident, that there will be radioactive contamination that takes out a lot of the farmland that is used to produce this. And ultimately, there's a real risk of collapse of the distribution system. The studies in 2007 and then more recently involving the same climate scientists and others demonstrated initially that they were looking at particularly corn and soybeans in the United States and rice, the prominent crop in China. And what we see is that there would be an immediate fall in production over the first year, and that there will be significant reductions in crop yields over the decade. The recent study involved some new information from Zia and other colleagues who looked not just at the original set of crops, but also at China's second and third largest crops, the corn and wheat. And what they were surprised to find, actually, was that the effect on those crops was even greater than the effect on the ones initially. And this has a significant implication for the results of the study. So originally, there was thought to be little impact on China because although there was a 10 to 20% reduction, there would be significant, reserve, and that Chinese society would be able to reorganize. But when we now look and see that it's including these other major crops, what we find is that their potential reserve, or the ability to respond in this populous country, would be reduced significantly. And therefore, we now have to include China as a potential victim of the starvation and malnutrition that would occur by this. So the original study looked at the number of people, nearly 3/4 billion, or more than 3/4 billion people on this planet who are currently malnourished, who are not getting significant or sufficient enough calories to lead productive lives. In addition, there are about 300 million other people who are living in countries like in Southeast Asia that are highly dependent on exports of food from these countries that would be massively affected. So what we see is that a 10 to 25 or even a 30% reduction in food production over a decade puts this entire group at risk. And if you combine that with the market turmoil that is likely to happen, the hoarding, the rise in food prices that typically accompany these kinds of shortages, many more people would be unable to afford or have access to food. And if we include China in this, what we recognize is really the entire world would be impacted. And the study concludes that this could lead to 1 to 2 billion people who would die from starvation alone, from a regional exchange of nuclear weapons that occurred in a far-off land. Small number of weapons, 0.5% of our current arsenals. So these findings do require a fundamental change in our thinking about nuclear weapons. First, we must understand that it is not only the arsenals of the United States and Russia that pose a global threat, but smaller nuclear powers like India and Pakistan threaten not only each other, but all of humanity. Second, we have to look at the much larger arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union in a totally different way. One Trident submarine in the US arsenal, its 24 missiles, 96 warheads, so approximately the same number of weapons in the scenario I just described, each one 20 to 30 times more powerful than the weapons that were described in the scenario. So one nuclear submarine in the United States fleet would be able to bring about this global climate catastrophe, killing 1 to 2 billion people. And the United States has 14 Trident submarines. Now, people have rightly recognized that we've done a lot of work in reducing nuclear weapons since the peak in the 1950s. However, even under the most rosy of circumstances, under the New START agreement, which allowed a little bit over 1,500 weapons apiece, if we use the same scenarios and suppose that there was either an accidental or intentional release of nuclear weapons, what would the effects be? And whether we're talking about fear of nuclear weapons over the Ukraine, or an accidental use of them because of failure of our command and control environments or just simply an accident, what would happen? Well, instead of 5 million tons of soot and debris being launched into the upper atmosphere, we're now talking 150 million tons. This would create so much soot that it represents the nuclear winter scenario that was discussed in the 80s. So this reconfirms those results. What it shows is that there are massive reductions in temperature, an average not of 1.25 degrees, but 8 degrees in centigrade over the decade. There are areas of the United States and the Soviet Union where there are 30-degree reductions in centigrade, in temperature. The Earth has not experienced temperatures of this cold since the coldest part of the last ice age. It is very conceivable and likely that not only would all agricultural production stop, but that most of human life would die, and probably most of all life on the planet. So this puts us at a crossroads. We ultimately have to make a decision. We can no longer remain on the path that we are on and expect there to be a different outcome from the direction that we are heading. It is inevitable that if we do not remove these weapons from our societies, that eventually they will be used, and we will not survive. Now, I've been working for some 30 years now on this project to remove nuclear weapons, and Physicians for Social Responsibility also works on all of the gravest threats to human health and survival, including climate and toxic degradation. And it really struck me when my son was born a couple of years ago that we don't have the time and the luxury. The president may have said that it wasn't in his lifetime, but when I look at my son, it is going to be in his lifetime because there is no alternative. He is going to face the consequences. We're already facing the consequences of what climate change has done to this planet. So there is no luxury of time here. We must act, and we must act now. But I think there really is hope, and I'm going to spend the last few minutes, I hope, in proposing a framework together that we may take forward. I think it is possible to safely and sustainably live on this planet. We can eliminate nuclear weapons and redirect the $105 billion that are spent on them annually to solving our other problems. I think that if we remove nuclear weapons alone, in isolation, we will not have saved this planet. There are many things lined up that are going to kill us. We have to figure out how the elimination of nuclear weapons will, as I mentioned before, change our way of thinking in such a way that we set up the consequences of solving the other problems. So these critical issues of nuclear weapons, climate change, poverty, toxic degradation of the environment, they're not going to be dealt with easily. All of us must play our part. This is not about the 99% and the 1%. This is about the 100%. This is not about non-nuclear weapon states or nuclear weapon states. This is about all states. We have got to find a solution where we all work together to ensure our survival. We have to find a way of using our spheres of influence to change the level of discourse. There is no discourse now. The hostility and the arrogance between us, we are not talking to each other, we're talking past each other. We have to find out a way to reach out to all people and to change our way of thinking and find positive solutions. And I'm going to propose a couple of ethical principles, given our context today, that I hope might be a start. And they're really just proposals. I'm going to propose 3 principles and potentially 3 practices that each one of us can use to take this process forward. One on a personal level, one on a community level, and one on a global level. I guess you could say this is my prescription for survival. On a personal level, I think the principle is one of respect, recognizing the inherent equality of all people and of all life on this planet. We have to respect each and every one of us. We must learn to love ourselves first, and then expand that compassion to everyone else. We have to recognize that we are each products of 13.5 billion years of evolution. We are success stories, every one of us. Our ancestors all had to have survived for us to be here. So we're in a way all miracles. And this means that we have to talk to one another in a different way. We have to accept ourselves and accept others and come to resolution of our conflicts without violence. On a community level, I think the principle is one of interdependence. Science has taught us just how interdependent our systems are. Whether it's our food production, as I've described, whether it is our economies, which we frequently talk about, even the air that we breathe, we are highly integrated. So the purpose or the practice is one of altruism and generosity. I should have mentioned that we know now that dust that comes off the Sahara Desert affects the asthma rates in the United States. We know that diseases, whether it's SARS or Ebola, they neglect national boundaries and affect many people. We know that climate change is going to create chaos across the planet. So if we are to survive, we have to understand that it is our survival tied to the survival of everyone else. We cannot imagine ourselves living in a bubble when the rest of the world is suffering or starving. That it actually is a selfish act for us to help others, because in doing so, we help ourselves. And there are many more others than there are us. On a global level, I think the principle is one of universal responsibility. It's quite remarkable that we've had this opportunity to see the planet from space. We only live just on this one planet. I think Rusty Schweiker may have said it best when the Apollo astronaut, when he was looking out at the planet from the capsule, and he said that anything that he cared about, all art and music and people that he loved, and anyone that he ever would love, was on that blue and white speck that he could cover up with his thumb from the window. There is no other place we can go. And I don't know if you've seen, and I probably should have included a picture, when you look at the Earth from the side, the amount of atmosphere and life on this planet is like a thin, thin speck. It's like the thickness of a balloon around the center air. We have very little space on which we have to live. And so what this really tells us in some ways is that our responsibility is not just to ourselves and our generation, but to all future generations. It's like the Native American proverb that says, we do not inherit this planet from our grandparents. We are borrowing it from our grandchildren. So the practice we must have is one of restraint. We cannot consume the way we have been doing. It is absolutely necessary for us to balance what our needs are with those of the future. Now, these principles and practices are, I think, a foundation for a dialogue amongst all of us on how we can survive. But there are some practical things that I would also advocate for. I think it is essential for us to become informed, to be educated not only about the problems and the humanitarian impact of these weapons, which are so terrible, but we also need to understand what the solutions are and be able to speak to the solutions and the hope. We cannot make the same mistake we made in the 80s, which was to scare everyone to death, but not solve the problem. We can advocate for a ban on nuclear weapons and eventually a convention eliminating all weapons of mass destruction. You can sign the abolition or humanitarian impact petition, and Martin Fleck, who's our security director from PSR, is here today with that petition. You can be part of the larger solution. You can advocate for reducing our carbon footprint and switch to sustainable and renewable energy sources. And you can live more healthily and sustainably for the benefit of the planet and all future generations. Now, I started this talk with a quote from Einstein that showed what was our predicament, that we had to change our way of thinking if we were to survive. We have not changed that way of thinking. We are at a tipping point. This is the time. We have an opportunity. And I'd like to end with another quote from Einstein, which I think does cover this for us. A human being is part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. We experience ourselves, our thoughts, our feelings, as something separate from the rest. It's kind of an optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. I think this is our task. It's PSR's task, it's IPPNW's task, it's SGI's task, it's our diplomats' task, it's the students' task, that we must take this on. And we can be seen as a force that will be so powerful that it will overcome whatever darkness and inertia and inevitability of our destruction that we see. If there are 7 billion people on this planet who have, by either inaction or doing small bad things, have led us to this crisis, it only takes each one of us doing one small thing on a daily basis in the right direction, 7 billion people doing the right thing, to immediately turn this thing around. And we do not have the luxury of time. Every day is borrowed time, and for my son's future and all of our sons and daughters' futures, let's do this. Thank you. So, yes, thank you. There actually, I'll just take it. Jonathan, yes?
When would you be kind enough to make a YouTube of this that we could all post? Because I thought your presentation was compelling, clear. You could cut it down by 20% to get it on YouTube.
Yep.
It is anyone could understand it, and the closing quote is so perfect. So I would urge you to do that, and we will post it, and I hope others will post it as well.
So the question was whether or not we could actually take this presentation, tighten it up a little bit, and make it available on YouTube and for wide distribution, and GSI and others would make it available. We have a not only is this being web streamed right now, but there will be versions of this video that will be made available, and we will certainly do that. And I'll take maybe one more question as we have our distinguished speaker here. Yes?
Yes, you mentioned the India-Pakistan hypothetical war might kill 1 to 2 billion people from starvation alone. Has anybody dared to make estimates of what would happen if there were a U.S.-Russia war, or is that just too unknown?
So I might not have been, so the question was whether this scenario that was described involving 0.5% of the arsenals in India and Pakistan killing 1 to 2 billion people could compare, or how would it compare to a U.S. and Russia war? I might not have been totally clear in my presentation, but the scenario that I described at the end, which involved the 1,500 weapons allowed to the U.S. and Russia under the New START agreement, was that scenario. There wasn't much purpose in actually calculating the numbers because there would be no agricultural production across most of the northern hemisphere for a decade. This would involve widespread starvation across the entire planet of not just human but animal species, that there would be complete collapse of the ecosystem and most likely death of if not extinction, of the human race. So that was the scenario, whether by accident or by design, there was an actual exchange of the, even less than the current weapons, but the amount of weapons allowed under the New START Treaty. And now I will turn it over.